how different countries fight wars. When nations go to war, they employ all manner of doctrines that are believed to be the most efficient ways to ensure victory. Whether based on economic, geographic, cultural, or other factors, many nations' methods for fighting wars have become well known and almost stereotypical. Whether completely accurate or based on misconceptions, here are some ways that nations fight their wars. The United States. When one imagines the United States going to war, thoughts immediately turn to high-tech military hardware, bringing copious amounts of firepower to bear against an overwhelmed enemy that has little chance against the onslaught. But is this true? Well, in short, yes. In the 20th century, the US has taken a much more active role in world affairs, and as a consequence has expended tremendous effort towards its military. As of 2023, the Americans spent $877 billion per year, more than the next 10 nations combined. This, along with extensive technological development, means that American forces have access to some of the most technologically advanced military hardware in the world. While not the largest in numerical terms, the US military can bring more firepower to bear at any given moment than any other nation. U.S. doctrine relies on power projection, the ability to fight sustained conflicts well outside the nation's borders. The centerpiece of this strategy is the large fleet of aircraft carriers. Of the 21 currently active aircraft carriers, 11 belong to the U.S. Navy, with the next nations with 2 each. On a modern battlefield, arguably the most decisive element is air superiority. In order to control the skies, the United States has access to a large number of aircraft, including strategic bombers, fifth-generation fighters, close air support to aid troops on the ground, cargo planes, reconnaissance and surveillance craft, among many others. Hey Simple History fans, with the vast digital world around us, I've been in search of a new browser that can not only streamline my workflow, but enhance my browsing experience. It's how I stumbled upon the new Opera desktop browser. Now here's the thing, I've got multiple interests. Whether I'm buying stuff on Amazon or checking out Airbnb stays, I've got a ton of tabs open. With Opera's tab islands, my life got way easier. Tabs get organized into these groups or islands, so no more clutter. But hang on, you know how we use different messenger and music apps? Opera Desktop integrates them all. Spotify, Apple Music, WhatsApp, Telegram, everything in one piece. And as for me, I value online privacy. Opera's free VPN and ad blocker are game changers. Now let's talk AI. Meet Aria, Opera's browser AI. Quickly highlight some text and Aria can explain, explore, or even translate it for me. That's pretty cool, right? Remember, it's not just about browsing, it's about enhanced, smooth, and efficient online experiences. Try out Opera Desktop for yourselves. Check out the link in the description to download Opera Desktop for free, and you'll see the difference for yourselves. Here's to a better browsing future. Because of this, there's an anecdote saying that the world's largest air force is the US Air Force, and the second largest is the US Navy. This isn't exactly true, however. The largest air force is in fact the US Air Force. The second largest is the US Army Aviation. The third largest is the Russian Air Force, with the US Navy relegated to 4th place. The 7th place spot goes to the US Marine Corps. In total, the American military can deploy over 13,000 aircraft, with the closest rival, the Russian Air Force, consisting of a bit over 4,000. In addition, the US has over 750 military bases in 80 countries around the world, meaning American troops can respond to crises anywhere in just a few days. In recent decades, more and more emphasis has been placed on the use of unmanned drones, which enable the American military to engage foes from hundreds or even thousands of miles away, a testament to the technological edge the US has over many opponents. The key to American force projection is industry and logistics. Because the US is geographically isolated from many hotspots around the world, extensive logistic chains have been developed. Currently, the overwhelming majority of the military are involved in logistics and support duties rather than frontline service. Wherever Americans are deployed, they will have the necessary food, ammunition, fuel, and whatever else they need to complete their mission. American military spending enables the ability to utilize what's been dubbed shock and awe, a term that was developed during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Foes are overwhelmed with immense firepower and cutting-edge hardware that's almost impossible to resist in a direct engagement. Wherever American soldiers are deployed, they will almost certainly have at their disposal some of the highest technological advancements available, backed up by an extensive logistics chain that far outstrips virtually any rival power. Germany. During both World Wars, Germany began the conflict using rapid advances, earning them a reputation for blitzkrieg, or lightning war, though they never used that term in any official context. In both cases, however, the initial successes gave way to Germany adopting a more defensive posture, digging in against Entente and Allied counteroffensives. During World War I, after the initial success of the Schlieffen Plan, the German army created an elaborate network of trenches, fortifying large stretches of the Western Front with layers of defenses. After suffering heavy casualties in the early portion of the war, the German High Command developed a layered defense in depth. Called elastic defense, the doctrine called for allowing the enemy to attack, steadily increasing the intensity of resistance until the enemy was overextended, and then launching a counterattack which drove back the enemy while minimizing German casualties. During the Second World War, the Germans constructed an elaborate network of fortifications in what were known as the Atlantic Wall along the Atlantic coast to repel any Allied seaborne invasion, and the Siegfried Line, which ran between the border of France and Germany. The linchpin of both designs were defensive bunkers, fixed emplacements designed to withstand virtually anything the enemy could throw at them. They were usually made from reinforced concrete, which could be several feet thick, with firing ports for machine guns, mortars, and other weaponry. They would be positioned in strategic locations, such as around towns and cities, advantageous locations around trench lines, and often on the reverse slope of a hill. This did limit the range of the bunker's weaponry, but the advantage of surprise made up for the loss of range. A particularly well-enforced bunker or pillbox could withstand a direct hit from heavy artillery, and in later years, aerial bombardment. These bunkers were so well made that on numerous occasions, enemy forces would bypass them during their advance, leaving the bunkers and pillboxes as islands of resistance in a sea of foes. German forces also made use of small one-man fortified positions known as Tobruks after the Libyan city, which was the site of an important siege in the Second World War. These concrete structures were circular, allowing the occupant a 360-degree field of fire with his weaponry, usually a machine gun. Some Tobruks were open-topped, but there were other single-man bunkers which were capped with tank turrets, giving the occupant much greater protection. While rapid-moving mechanized forces may have received the most attention, it was the extensive defensive positions that Germany employed that was a key component to Germany's overall military strategy. China. During the Korean War, UN troops drove back the North Koreans from their southern neighbors. As they advanced north, they encountered Chinese soldiers who threw themselves at the enemy in a tidal wave of bodies, overwhelming them in sheer weight of numbers. Is this accurate, or a misunderstanding of Chinese tactics? As one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, China has a long history of warfare against both internal and external threats. The Art of War by Sun Tzu is widely regarded as one of the first military manuals in the world that could be traced back to the 5th century BCE. Other innovations in military development have their origins in China, especially gunpowder, which has had arguably more of an impact than any other invention. Today, China has the second largest military expenditure after the United States and has the largest military in the world in terms of number and is extensively trained in combined arms, utilizing infantry, armored forces, air power, naval forces, and special operations units, as well as a large reserve of nuclear weapons should the need arise. So where did the idea of massive waves of conscripts charging the enemy, throwing men at the enemy until they run out of ammunition come from? Well, for starters, China has a titanic population, and until early 2023, it was the most populated nation on the planet. With about 1/5 of the world's population living in China, there is a pre-existing perception that they have manpower to spare and are able to absorb casualties that would cripple other nations. The reputation of the Chinese forces using human wave tactics began during the Korean War. Chinese soldiers would mass against an enemy position and then attempt to overrun it with sheer weight of numbers. To those on the receiving end of such an assault, it seemed like endless waves of Chinese infantry were crashing towards them. In reality, Chinese tactics were much more sophisticated. Under the cover of darkness, infiltration teams would creep close to the enemy and at a prearranged signal, such as a bugle or a gong, they would surge forward in an attempt to overrun the position using shock and violence of action. Should the action fail, however, another infiltration team would make their attempt, repeating the process, though without the element of surprise. While this was going on, other forces would attempt to slip around the enemy and attack from the rear. Due to poor communications, this process can be repeated over and over again, regardless of casualties, giving those who face it the impression that they're being assaulted by waves of Chinese troops. This was exacerbated by journalists reporting on the war, who wanted to give the impression of American and other UN forces being overwhelmed by hordes of enemy soldiers. Those who actually faced such tactics knew differently, with American soldiers remarking sardonically, "How many hordes are there in a Chinese platoon?" Russia and the Soviet Union. Russia and the Soviet Union was and is the largest nation on the planet, with vast expanses of territory. It's also home to a large population compared to other European powers. To their foes, such as the French during the Napoleonic era, or the Germans in the 20th century, fighting Russia or the Soviet Union was a never-ending trek through hostile environments, facing waves after waves of stubborn defenders, being ground down over time in a never-ending war of attrition. But is this accurate? It is true that Russia is a titanic landmass, and invading the nation requires extensive logistics and marching over seemingly endless territory. In the words of Army Group South's commander Gerd von Rundstedt, "The vastness of Russia devours us." Compounding the environmental issues were the weather conditions, such as deep mud in the autumn that can stop armies in their tracks, and later the severe winters that crippled virtually all invaders. While dealing with these conditions, they would be subject to swarms of Russian or Soviet soldiers who would overwhelm them with human wave attacks and the weight of seemingly endless numbers. This last part is not exactly accurate, however. In spite of Russia's landmass, the vast majority of the population and infrastructure lives west of the Ural Mountains. Though impressive on a map, it is impossible to withdraw the entire population, as well as vital infrastructure, further east, though the Soviets did move many factories to these safer locations. During Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union faced a severe crisis, as Wehrmacht forces captured vast areas of territory, killing or capturing millions of Red Army soldiers. Joseph Stalin's infamous Order 227, nicknamed the Not One Step Back Order, issued in July 1942, demanded that Soviet forces stand their ground. To quote the order directly, "Every commander, every soldier and political officer has to realize that our resources are not infinite." Stalin then goes on to openly state that there is no way the Soviets could retreat endlessly, and that every bit of ground taken strengthens the enemy and weakens the Soviet war effort. The bulk of the text explains why it was so important that they stand their ground and not continue to retreat deeper into Soviet territory. On the battlefield, Soviet soldiers were believed to throw themselves at the enemy in massive human waves, often without weapons. This is a gross misunderstanding. The main Soviet doctrine is referred to as deep battle, which is similar to the German Blitzkrieg, using massed frontal assaults to break enemy lines, penetrating deep into enemy territory. However, especially in the earlier stages of the war, the Soviets were on the defensive and suffered massive casualties. The Red Army was disorganized, especially in areas surrounded by the Wehrmacht, leading to uncoordinated assaults against prepared German positions with limited communications and inexperienced officers and soldiers. Some of those who participated in the assaults were heavy weapon crews who often didn't have a secondary weapon, or NKVD troops armed only with pistols, which gave the impression of charging without weapons in the confusion of battle. These myths entered popular consciousness based on memoirs written after the war and reinforced by Hollywood movies which dramatized the false notion of endless waves of Russians and Soviets hurling themselves at the enemy without weapons. Vietnam. It's all fun and games until the trees start speaking Vietnamese. When French and later American and other allied nations sought influence over the tiny and impoverished nation of Indochina, later called Vietnam, they possessed some of the most advanced weaponry available at the time. Facing them were poorly equipped guerrilla fighters that somehow managed to halt world superpowers. The terrain of Vietnam is filled with dense jungles, rugged mountains, and expansive rice paddies that make travel difficult even under the best of circumstances. The Vietnamese who fought against foreign invaders took full advantage of this, moving quickly and quietly through the wilderness, appearing where they were least expected, striking at their enemies before melting back into the jungle with hardly any trace. Baffled Americans and others would ponderously trample after them without success. Aiding their ability to seemingly disappear into thin air was an extremely elaborate system of tunnels, some of which ran for miles underground and were rumored to be able to withstand direct hits from a B-52 strike. These underground facilities were elaborate, consisting of barracks, medical facilities, weapons storage, and manufacturing locations, and even cinemas and other entertainment venues. The entrances to these tunnels would be well hidden and virtually undetectable. Should they be discovered, collapsing them or stealing them was impossible, as the tunnel system was too extensive to be simply neutralized in this way. The only way to deal with these underground facilities was the unenviable task of tunnel rat, crawling into the dark, unknown spaces with a flashlight and a pistol. The Vietnamese also made extensive use of booby traps, anything from punji pits to impale an unwary soldier's foot to tripwires attached to grenades or other explosives to any number of ingenious devices would force Americans and other enemies into a state of near constant paranoia. In a direct military engagement, Vietnamese forces would almost certainly lose. There was simply no way they could stand up to the massed firepower that can be brought to bear against them by their technologically superior foes. However, they didn't need to win a direct military engagement. Instead, their main focus was on time and morale. With each passing day, more American soldiers would arrive home in coffins or crippled for life, eroding American will to continue the conflict. Even defeats would be turned into victories. In 1968, the Viet Cong and the NVA launched the Tet Offensive, a coordinated strike against American and South Vietnamese military installations around the country. The centerpiece of this would be an attack on the embassy in Saigon. Though this attack and the rest of the Tet Offensive was a disaster in military terms, it was ultimately a victory. Seeing the American embassy violated in such a way, along with the daily images of the brutal fighting, sapped the American public's willingness to continue with the conflict. In the end, the Vietnamese did not need to win a military victory, but rather a political one. France. France has an unfortunate and completely false reputation of being a nation of cowards, whose soldiers surrender at the first opportunity. In truth, however, the French have one of the most distinguished records in military history. In the modern day, the French military utilizes the principles of speed, decentralized command, and precision strikes with small numbers of highly motivated troops. This doctrine is in stark contrast to the sledgehammer blows of other major world powers, such as their NATO allies, the United States. This was a deliberate response to the First and Second World Wars, where French troops stood toe-to-toe with their adversaries in direct force engagements, leading to catastrophic casualties. When French territory is potentially threatened, such as during the Cold War, French doctrine centered around the principle that good defense was a strong offense. Knowing that going toe-to-toe against a Warsaw Pact invasion would end in disaster, French planners relied on speed, mobility, and audacity, using aggression and violence of action in blitzkrieg-inspired strikes against the enemy. French sub-commanders were given a great deal of leeway to make decisions, and a culture of audacity of risk-taking was encouraged. This is designed to maintain the ability to act aggressively against threats while also remaining flexible to the ever-changing conditions on the battlefield, without having to ask for permission from a slow-moving chain of command. As a result, the French military prioritized quality over quantity, with a small number of troops able to strike with precision rather than trade blows with the enemy in direct force-on-force engagements, using the minimum amount of force necessary to complete the objective. In one example, in 2007, a large rebel advance in the Central African Republic was stopped in its tracks by around 100 troops and 2 fighter jets. This doctrine is very cost-effective, limiting the amount of resources spent on a particular engagement and reducing the number of potential casualties. By picking their battles and using their existing forces with surgical precision, the French military is able to hit far above its weight class and tie limited numbers to the highest degree possible. When nations go to war, they utilize a multitude of methods to win victory. Whether a stereotype or based in reality, there are as many ways to win as there are nations and cultures on the planet.